How did McLaren go from being completely lost with the 2026 regulations to becoming the team that is now being watched by the FIA? Because this is no longer a simple aerodynamic improvement. The entire paddock became suspicious when the MCL40 went from suffering very serious performance and reliability problems to showing a pace capable of putting the strongest teams on the grid on the ropes. And we're not talking about a small improvement. The differences that McLaren began to show were so exaggerated that several within Formula One began to wonder if the British team had found a technical gap that no one else understood yet. The most shocking thing of all is that at the beginning of the season, Andrea Stella admitted that McLaren was completely confused with the behavior of the car and the new hybrid power unit. They were between half a second and a second per lap behind Mercedes. The car suffered with power delivery, had electrical problems, and seemed far from any major fight. But then something happened that totally changed the season. In silence, McLaren began to work on something huge. The problem is that to understand why the FIA began to set its sights on McLaren, you first have to understand how disastrous its start to the 2026 season was. Because today we see the MCL40 as one of the most feared cars in the paddock. But at the beginning of the year, the reality was completely different. McLaren started the new technical regulations practically lost. The team's internal data showed alarming differences compared to Mercedes, even using the same power unit. Andrea Stella publicly acknowledged that they were perplexed, trying to understand why the car couldn't extract the expected performance from the new hybrid system. And this is where this whole story really begins. Formula One in 2026 radically changed the behavior of the cars. The disappearance of the MGUH completely transformed the way energy is managed, while the new MGUK began to generate a gigantic amount of electricity compared to previous years. Teams had to learn practically from scratch how to deploy that power without destroying the car's balance or running out of power at the end of straights. And McLaren was one of the teams that suffered the most from this process. During the first races, the car had very serious problems. Not only were they slow, they also suffered electrical failures, difficulties maintaining energy charge, and enormous inconsistencies in race pace. On some circuits, the car seemed competitive in qualifying, but it completely collapsed on long runs. In others, they directly disappeared from the map compared to Mercedes, Ferrari, or even Red Bull. And this is where something extremely important appears. While the rest of the teams began to introduce aggressive improvements from the first rounds of the championship, McLaren made a completely different decision. A very risky decision. Andrea Stella and Rob Marshall decided to practically freeze the visible development of the car for several weeks. And this generated a lot of criticism. Many thought McLaren was falling behind. Others believed they simply did not understand the 2026 regulation. But internally, the team was working on something else, much more important. Fully understanding how aerodynamics and the new hybrid system interacted. Because introducing new parts without first understanding the energy behavior of the car could further destroy the overall performance. That was the key point. McLaren quietly disappeared from the media spotlight while analyzing massive amounts of data. They wanted to understand how to manage electrical energy, how to avoid the famous lift and coast that was affecting many teams, and above all, how to keep the aerodynamic load stable when the hybrid system began to modify the balance of the car on the straight and exiting corners. And little by little they began to find something. Because according to information from the paddock, the Japanese Grand Prix was one of the first moments where McLaren really understood the complete behavior of the MCL40. From there, the car started to look different, more stable, more efficient, more aggressive in fast corners. But still no one imagined what was to come. Then Miami arrived, and then everything exploded. McLaren presented a package of improvements that completely changed the competitive order of Formula One. Suddenly the British car was not only fast, it was absurdly efficient. The pace of the race began to scare several teams. The degradation seemed much more controlled than that of its rivals, and the energy performance of the car was radically superior in certain sectors of the circuit. It was at that moment that suspicions began. Because one thing is to improve, but it is quite another to take such an extreme leap in such a short time. And within the paddock, several teams began to wonder exactly what McLaren had found, and whether everything they were doing really fit within the spirit of the new 2026 technical regulations. And this is where the story starts to get really dangerous for the rest of the teams. Because after Miami, the paddock stopped seeing McLaren as a simple surprise, and began to observe them as a possible technical threat to the entire Formula One of 2026. The MCL40 change was too exaggerated. It wasn't just a matter of pure speed. The car seemed to operate under a different logic than the rest. While many teams continued to struggle with energy degradation, loss of performance at the end of straights, and difficulties in keeping downforce stable, McLaren began to show exactly the opposite. The car maintained stability. It kept pace, maintained efficiency, and most suspicious of all, it maintained electrical power for longer than several of its direct rivals. That's where the uncomfortable questions began within the paddock, because some rival engineers began to suspect that McLaren had found an extremely efficient way to integrate energy deployment with the car's aerodynamic platform. Something that in theory everyone was trying to do, but that no one seemed to have achieved at the level of the British team. And this in modern Formula One changes absolutely everything. Because with the 2026 regulation, energy management stopped being a complement and became practically the heart of the car's performance. The car that manages to best deploy hybrid energy without destroying tires, without compromising stability, and without running empty on a straight line, has a gigantic advantage. That is precisely why McLaren's improvement began to generate so much noise. The rivals did not understand how they had gone from suffering electrical failures and balance problems to having one of the most complete cars on the grid in just a few races. And here another very important detail appears. McLaren already had a history of attracting the attention of the FIA in previous seasons for certain innovative technical solutions. So when the MCL40 jump started looking so aggressive, some teams began quietly pushing for deeper revisions. Because in Formula One there is something that always happens. When a team finds too much performance too quickly, the paddock automatically becomes suspicious, especially when we talk about gray areas of the regulations, especially when we talk about hybrid systems, thermal management, and dynamic aerodynamic behavior. And precisely those would be the areas that began to arouse interest within the FIA. According to the information circulating within the paddock, several teams began to collect comparative data on the McLaren's behavior in acceleration, sustained speed, and energy conservation. Some rival engineers could not understand how the MCL40 managed to maintain such consistency even on circuits where other cars began to suffer a drop in electrical performance after several laps. And the more they analyzed the data, the stranger everything seemed. Because normally when a car greatly increases its energy efficiency, it sacrifices other areas. You can lose downforce. It can overheat tires, can get twitchy in fast corners. But the McLaren seemed to avoid much of those compromises. That was when a theory began to take hold within the paddock. The possibility that McLaren had found an extremely advanced solution in the interaction between suspension, aerodynamics, and hybrid management. A concept capable of keeping the car within a much more stable performance window than the rest. And if that was true, the FIA had real reasons to watch them closely. Because although finding performance is not illegal, Formula One has a huge history of teams exploiting regulatory loopholes to the limits where the federation ends up intervening. It happened with suspensions. It happened with flat bottoms. It happened with flexible aerodynamic systems. And now many within the paddock believe that 2026 could open a new technical war related to energy management and the dynamic behavior of cars. The most worrying thing for rivals is that McLaren still does not seem to have shown its full potential. Because while other teams continue to understand the regulations, the Woking team gives the impression of having arrived first at a solution that could mark the entire new era of Formula One. But there is something even more important in this whole story, and the FIA would not only be concerned about McLaren's current performance. The real fear is what could happen if the rest of the teams don't catch up quickly. Because within the paddock there is already a feeling that the MCL40 could have found the right direction of the 2026 regulation before everyone else. And if that happens in Formula One, normally the championship changes completely. The history of this sport is full of similar examples. Teams that discovered before anyone else how to exploit a new regulation and built advantages that were impossible to cut for years. Braun GP in 2009. Mercedes in the hybrid era of 2014. Red Bull with modern ground effect. And now many are beginning to wonder if McLaren could be building exactly that kind of dominance for Formula One's new technical generation. Because the most alarming thing is not only the performance, it's the way they got it. McLaren spent months working in virtual silence while the rest of the paddock looked in other directions. While some teams were obsessed with pure aerodynamics, McLaren seemed to be concentrating on something much deeper. Understanding how to make absolutely every system in the car work together perfectly. And there could be the real key to the MCL40. Not a magic piece, not an isolated trick, but a total integration between hybrid energy, aerodynamic stability, suspension, and tire degradation. That would explain why the car is not only fast on a lap, but extremely consistent during long runs. It would explain why they seem to suffer less energy drop. It would explain why the car maintains balance even when others begin to lose stability after several laps pushing to the limit. And precisely for this reason the FIA would have begun to observe everything much more closely. Because when a team finds such an advanced solution within a new regulation, the federation needs to ensure that there is no overinterpretation of the technical gray areas. Especially in a season as delicate as 2026. An era where Formula One completely changed the philosophy of its engines, energy management, and the aerodynamic behavior of the cars. The problem for rivals is that even if the FIA reviews the car, that guarantees absolutely nothing. Because McLaren could have simply done a better job than everyone else. And that possibility is perhaps the most terrifying for Ferrari, Red Bull, and Mercedes, because it would mean that the Woking team didn't find a trap. He found the right path before the rest. And if that's true, then the 2026 championship could begin to tilt much faster than many imagined. But no one within the paddock can ignore such a wild jump in performance either. Because the reality is that the MCL40 went from being a lost car to becoming the car that is generating the most questions in all of Formula One. And when the FIA starts looking too closely at a team, let me know in the comments what you think about all this.